We executed 8 search warrants. We, the DEA, are partnered with state and local, other federal agencies, really across the United States.
9 kilograms of cocaine, 6.8 kilograms of crystal meth, more than $155,000 in cash, multiple weapons loaded and ready, not at a border crossing, not inside a shipping container, not in a distant desert corridor, inside a quiet suburban home in Marysville, Washington. Trimmed lawns, parked SUVs, morning routines unfolding like any other weekday. And behind one front door, enough narcotics and cash to supply a regional trafficking pipeline across western Washington. When ICE and FBI agents breached the house, it was clear within seconds this was not a routine arrest. The individual taken into custody was not a street-level dealer and not a random courier intercepted by chance. Federal charging documents, later detailed in reporting by Reuters, identified him as a suspected ringleader, a figure believed to be coordinating drug storage and distribution while blending seamlessly into everyday American life. This operation did not begin that morning. It ended that morning. At approximately 6:30 a.m., federal agents moved with precision, executing a plan built over months of surveillance. The entry was swift. The objective was control. The timing was deliberate. What unfolded in seconds had been developing quietly behind the scenes while the neighborhood slept. The arrest came at a moment when national attention was already fixed on high-profile corruption cases involving former federal drug agents, reported by both Reuters and the Associated Press. That broader backdrop intensified scrutiny around trafficking networks operating under the radar. But this raid was not reactive. It was calculated. It was the final closure of a trap that had been tightening for months. From the outside, the Marysville home blended perfectly into its surroundings. A residential street lined with similar houses, no visible security systems, no unusual fortifications, no outward signal of organized criminal infrastructure. Neighbors saw routine, investigators saw structure. At the center of that structure was Luis Aldo Alana Garcia, a 29-year-old Mexican national residing in Marysville. Publicly, he did not present the profile of a violent trafficker. No public display of force. No visible cartel symbolism, no overt indicators. According to investigators, that was precisely the advantage. Rather than acting as a frontline distributor, Garcia was alleged to function as a logistics controller, managing storage, coordinating transfers, and serving as a localized node within larger supply chains tied to cocaine and methamphetamine entering the region. The quantities seized from the residents, 9 kilograms of cocaine and 6.8 kilograms of meth, were not consistent with personal use or small-scale dealing. Federal affidavits described the house as a staging point, a temporary holding site where narcotics were consolidated, divided, and redirected deeper into distribution channels. That detail reframes the entire operation. Cartel-linked networks increasingly avoid obvious high-risk zones. Instead, they embed inside stable residential areas where predictability becomes camouflage. Reporting from the Associated Press and Reuters has repeatedly documented the use of suburban stash houses as a preferred tactic precisely because they attract less suspicion. Familiarity becomes a shield. In Marysville, that shield appears to have held for a significant period. While the exterior remained quiet, investigators were mapping contacts, analyzing movement patterns, and building a prosecutable timeline. Surveillance was patient. Evidence was layered. The objective was not a quick disruption. It was structural exposure. Which raises the core operational question: how can a trafficking node function for months, potentially longer, inside an American neighborhood without triggering visible alarm? The answer lies in precision and restraint. When the door came down, the illusion collapsed instantly. The house transitioned from suburban anonymity to a controlled federal crime scene in seconds. Agents entered with overwhelming speed, clearing rooms methodically, securing occupants, and locking down the interior before evidence could be destroyed. Commands were sharp, movements were rehearsed. The entry sequence was designed to dominate the environment immediately. According to later reporting confirmed by Reuters, the operation prioritized speed to prevent resistance or destruction of material. The goal was total control within moments. And in those moments, what had appeared ordinary was exposed as something far more strategic, a concealed distribution hub operating in plain sight. As the house was secured, the first operational layer surfaced almost immediately. Cocaine packages were located in spaces that, at first glance, appeared completely ordinary. Tucked behind furniture, concealed inside storage compartments that blended seamlessly into the layout of the home. Nothing flashy, nothing theatrical, just calculated placement designed to avoid casual discovery. Moments later, agents uncovered crystal methamphetamine stored separately, sealed, and packaged for controlled movement. Not loose, not prepared for street-level sale, but staged for transfer. That separation was not incidental. Federal affidavits later described it as a clear indicator of structured logistics. This was not a retail operation. It was a temporary holding point inside a broader distribution architecture. Product entered, product stabilized, product exited. Then the cash surfaced. Bundles of currency were recovered from multiple concealed locations throughout the residence. Not a single stack, not a single compartment. Distributed placement suggested repeated transactions, a continuous financial cycle rather than a one-time payout. The total exceeded $155,000, an amount significant enough to signal sustained coordination. Steady flow, predictable rhythm, active throughput, and then the weapons. They were not decorative, not symbolic, not locked away as relics. They were accessible, functional, positioned for immediate use. Their discovery shifted the operational posture of the scene instantly. What had begun as a high-volume narcotics seizure now carried the markers of organized criminal protection infrastructure. This was no longer just inventory. It was a secured node. As agents advanced deeper into the house, the physical layout began to reinforce that conclusion. Storage areas were positioned with intention. Certain rooms lacked the normal density of personal belongings expected in an active residence. Access points allowed for controlled movement without unnecessary exposure. On the surface, it was a home. Underneath it operated as a logistics platform. According to analysis cited by the Associated Press, similar federal cases have shown an increasing reliance on residential staging points as trafficking networks move away from obvious warehouse environments. Suburban properties offer insulation. Predictability reduces suspicion. Normalcy becomes operational camouflage. Luis Aldo Alana Garcia was taken into custody during the operation without incident. That detail mattered. He was not found actively processing narcotics. He was not intercepted during a delivery. Prosecutors, referencing court documents later detailed by Reuters, described him as a coordinator, an individual responsible for managing flow rather than physically handling product. Court filings allege that Garcia directed shipment timing, determined how long inventory remained on site, and controlled outbound routing. He was believed to manage cadence, arrival windows, transition points. He controlled the rhythm. That distinction carries strategic weight. Street-level arrests are disruptive but replaceable. Coordinators are structural. Remove the individual who understands timing, trust chains, and routing patterns, and the network fractures at a deeper level. That is why federal agencies often wait. Even when a stash location is identified, immediate action is not always the objective. The mission expands beyond seizure. It becomes relationship mapping, communication tracing, financial layering. By the time agents executed the entry, months of invisible groundwork had already been completed. The breach was the visible conclusion of a much longer operation, and that reframes the entire event. What happened in Marysville was not the beginning of enforcement pressure. It was the final move in a strategy that had been unfolding quietly, methodically, deliberately. The hunt began months earlier, in the summer of 2025. Analysts observed patterns that did not align with typical local narcotics activity in Western Washington. Movements, repeating at consistent intervals, transfers occurring on disciplined schedules, financial traces appearing disconnected from any legitimate commercial footprint. Individually, each signal was minor. Collectively, they indicated coordination. According to reporting later confirmed by Reuters, authorities chose patience over speed. Rather than executing an early disruption, the case transitioned into a joint operational framework integrating ICE, the FBI, Border Patrol, and the DEA. Each agency applied a different analytical lens. Immigration records were examined to identify cross-border linkages. Financial monitoring units flagged irregular cash behaviors and transaction anomalies. Surveillance teams focused on temporal mapping, not merely what was moved, but when movements occurred. Timing reveals structure. The objective was not to intercept a single shipment. It was to expose the system driving them. Month after month, investigators watched without moving. Phones were mapped. Contact chains were logged. Communication patterns were reconstructed slowly, methodically. Instead of relying on dramatic undercover buys or visible takedowns, the task force dismantled the structure analytically, identifying who issued instructions, who waited for confirmation, and who deliberately never touched the product at all. That distinction mattered. Act too early, and only the outer layer collapses. the deeper architecture survives, rebuilds, adapts. Restraint was not hesitation, it was strategy. As the operational picture sharpened, one detail became increasingly revealing. Nothing changed. There were no sudden relocations, no abrupt pauses in movement, no spike in caution, no signs of panic. The system remained calm. For investigators, that stability carried weight. Trafficking networks alter behavior when they sense exposure. Here, cadence held steady. Transfers continued on schedule. Communication windows stayed consistent. Activity did not contract. That suggested confidence. The Associated Press has highlighted this pattern in comparable federal cases. Modern cartel cells frequently rely on routine rather than intimidation. They avoid spectacle. They avoid noise. They embed within residential normalcy and assume familiarity will shield them from scrutiny. Routine becomes camouflage. Invisibility becomes protection. Time becomes growth. And time was exactly what investigators allowed them to believe they had. Only after months of observation did prosecutors begin constructing the legal architecture for intervention. Financial trails were matched to physical addresses. Communication timestamps were aligned with suspected delivery cycles. Surveillance logs were cross-referenced against travel data. By the time search warrants were prepared, the objective had evolved. This was no longer about recovering narcotics. It was about establishing control. Federal filings later described how investigators waited until they could demonstrate not just possession but direction, not just storage but command, proving that someone dictated rhythm, timing, flow. When judicial authorization was granted, it was not limited to a single door. Multiple targets were approved within the same operational window. That synchronization was critical. It prevented warning signals from cascading through the network. It denied the system time to adapt mid-strike. The approach reflected a broader enforcement posture repeatedly emphasized in Justice Department briefings and reported by Reuters. Patience first, action last. Public perception often imagines enforcement as immediate and reactive. In reality, the most destabilizing operations are delayed. They land only after every layer has been diagrammed, every node identified, and every dependency understood. By the time the entry team moves, the outcome is already engineered. Yet the Marysville case forces a deeper question. If a cartel-linked logistics node could operate for months inside an American community without interruption, what allowed that confidence to solidify? The answer may not be rooted in intimidation or weaponry. It may be rooted in belief. The belief that silence equals safety. That as long as routines remain undisturbed and attention stays elsewhere, the operation remains invisible. For a prolonged stretch, the network appeared to operate under that assumption. Quiet enough to avoid notice, structured enough to scale, patient enough to outlast casual scrutiny. But confidence can distort judgment. And the most dangerous advantage any trafficking organization possesses is not firepower. It is certainty. The certainty that someone, somewhere, is softening the perimeter. As the Marysville investigation advanced, federal attention began shifting toward a broader vulnerability, one not confined to that house, but linked to why networks like it sometimes feel secure operating in plain sight. Days before details of the Washington raid surfaced publicly, national headlines were dominated by a separate federal corruption case. Former DEA agent Joseph Bongiovanni had been convicted in federal court. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, Bongiovanni used his position to shield drug traffickers, redirect investigative pressure away from cartel-linked groups, leak sensitive operational information, and manipulate official documentation. His actions did more than protect individual suspects. They altered investigative trajectories, they misallocated resources, they compromised years of work, and the case was not isolated. Federal court data and Justice Department summaries cited by major outlets indicate that at least 17 federal law enforcement personnel over the past decade have faced charges tied to corruption-related offenses connected to drug trafficking cases. The allegations in those cases included bribery, obstruction of justice, and deliberate misuse of authority. These were not procedural oversights. They were structural breaches. Each conviction left behind compromised operations and unresolved damage assessments. Each instance forced agencies to re-examine internal safeguards, and for trafficking networks observing from the outside, such breaches carry meaning. Because when corruption penetrates enforcement structures, it does more than create opportunity. It creates confidence. When corruption cases surface, they send a signal. They reinforce a perception that law enforcement is not a single impenetrable wall, but a layered structure where fractures are possible. Organized criminal groups do not require widespread corruption to benefit from that perception. They require only the belief that leaks can exist. That belief alone alters behavior. It encourages routine. It discourages caution. It builds a quiet sense of insulation. Investigators working the Marysville case operated within that broader national context. There is no public evidence indicating that the suspect in Washington had direct contact with corrupt officials. However, the environment matters. Perception shapes strategy. Reporting by the Associated Press has observed that modern trafficking networks increasingly rely on predictability rather than secrecy. If operations continue uninterrupted, they interpret stability as safety. Corruption scandals in other jurisdictions reinforce that interpretation, even when no breach exists locally. Confidence does not require proof. It requires precedent. That helps explain why the operation tied to Luis Aldo Alana Garcia appeared stable for an extended period. There were no abrupt shutdowns, no rapid relocation of inventory, no visible attempt to dismantle the property from the outside. The system functioned as if it expected continuity. Investigators assessed that the structure was built to endure. That kind of operational confidence rarely comes from naivety. It comes from observing other networks survive exposure because warnings arrived early or pressure, fragmented before reaching the core. The impact of internal corruption extends beyond a single compromised case. Each breach becomes a lesson. It demonstrates response time. It exposes investigative patterns. It reveals pressure points. Over time, those lessons circulate. An evasion in one state becomes a template in another. A delayed response becomes a reference model. What begins as an isolated vulnerability can evolve into strategic adaptation. And that brings the Washington case into sharper focus. Garcia was not operating in isolation. The structure uncovered in Marysville reflected a broader operational pattern emerging across the state. Separate cartel-linked investigations in Washington, including major Sinaloa-connected takedowns reported by Reuters, displayed similar characteristics: residential staging points, layered logistics, extended operational quiet before enforcement moved. Different addresses, same architecture, suburban properties functioning as distribution. Nodes, controlled cadence, minimal noise, extended patience. When examined side by side, the similarities become structural rather than coincidental. They suggest networks that believed they understood the system well enough to operate within its blind spots. That belief proved incorrect, but it endured long enough to matter. The Marysville raid did more than remove narcotics and cash from circulation. It disrupted an operational assumption: the idea that silence and structural familiarity are sufficient protection. Yet a more complex question remains. If confidence built on perceived institutional weakness allowed these networks to expand, how many others are still operating under that same illusion? How many structures continue functioning in residential neighborhoods, convinced that routine equals invisibility? The Marysville case did not stand alone. As investigators processed the evidence recovered from that quiet suburban home, comparisons were already being drawn to another active federal investigation elsewhere in Washington. That separate case, reported by Reuters and the Associated Press, involved a cell linked to the Sinaloa Cartel, one of the most established trafficking organizations operating across North America. The operational details differed. The structural logic did not. In that investigation, federal authorities announced the arrest of 19 individuals connected to a Sinaloa-linked distribution network. Seizures included fentanyl, crystal methamphetamine, and multiple firearms, a combination indicating both commercial scale and defensive preparedness. Court filings summarized by Reuters described a network that relied on residential properties rather than commercial warehouses. Ordinary neighborhoods were used to store, stage, and redistribute narcotics. On the surface, the houses appeared routine. Internally, they functioned as coordinated logistics hubs. Placed side by side, the parallels between the Marysville operation and the Sinaloa-linked case become difficult to dismiss. Both networks favored calm environments over intimidation. Both prioritized stability instead of constant relocation. Both embedded themselves within predictable residential zones. And in both cases, those involved did not operate like fugitives under pressure. They operated like administrators managing supply chains, measured, structured, confident, until the moment that confidence collapsed. That pattern matters because it reveals how modern cartel operations have evolved. Violence still exists, but it is no longer the centerpiece. Continuity is. From a U.S. enforcement perspective, Washington state occupies a strategic position for a reason. It is not merely a destination market, it is a corridor, intersected by major highways, connected to active ports, and positioned near international trade routes that move enormous volumes of legitimate commerce every day. Access without constant scrutiny, analysts cited by the Associated Press have noted that Western states increasingly function as redistribution zones. Drugs arrive, are consolidated, broken down, and redirected inland. That logistical role gives Washington operational value, and value attracts organized investment. This is why federal authorities emphasize that arrests like those in Marysville represent more than isolated takedowns. Removing one cell reduces capacity, but it does not eliminate demand. If the broader structure remains intact, replacement is possible. A new renter, a new coordinator, the same routes, the same rhythm. Federal agencies have publicly acknowledged this replacement effect, particularly in regions where suburban stash houses have become normalized as a tactic. The Washington cases demonstrate how quietly that influence spreads. No overt territorial markers, no visible takeover, no dramatic shifts in neighborhood appearance, just patience. A property is acquired, activity remains measured, traffic appears ordinary, neighbors observe nothing unusual. Over time, invisibility becomes protection. By the moment enforcement intervenes, inventory may have already passed through multiple downstream channels. Yet recent arrests suggest a strategic adjustment. Federal agencies are increasingly targeting infrastructure rather than shipments alone. Reporting by Reuters indicates prosecutors are placing greater emphasis on conspiracy and coordination charges, focusing on those who manage timing, trust networks, and flow control rather than solely those caught in possession. That strategy requires time. It demands layered intelligence, but it penetrates deeper into operational structure. Still, the broader landscape remains complex. Multiple Sinaloa-linked investigations within Washington raise a difficult but necessary question. If these networks establish themselves in suburban environments without immediate disruption, how many similar structures are still functioning under the same model? Absence of noise does not equal absence of activity. In some cases, silence signals stability. This chapter is not about closure, it is about scale. The Marysville raid and the separate Sinaloa-linked takedown point toward a larger reality, one in which cartel logistics evolve faster than public awareness. Each arrest reveals more of the architecture, but it also hints at remaining layers beyond what is visible. Are these cases the decisive blows against entrenched networks in Washington? Or are they only the exposed edge of a broader structure still embedded behind ordinary doors? By the time the Marysville entry occurred and evidence was cataloged, the outline was already defined. What appeared sudden was the final step of a prolonged sequence, beginning with quiet surveillance, advancing through months of analytical tracking, and concluding with a precisely timed strike. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, this reflects the modern enforcement posture, not chasing visible street activity, but dismantling the structural systems that sustain it. From a U.S. perspective, the central lesson is not speed. It is coordination. ICE, the FBI, and partner agencies did not move independently. They did not rush. Intelligence was shared. Roles were aligned. Action followed only when the network map was complete. That patience transformed a suburban residence into a blueprint of a larger trafficking mechanism, demonstrating how deeply such operations can integrate into ordinary environments. At the same time, the case underscores a hard reality. Cartel networks do not rely on violence alone. They rely on structure, on timing, on routine, on the assumption that predictability equals safety. But once exposed, structure becomes vulnerability. Patterns become evidence. Confidence becomes traceable. The fight does not conclude with a single arrest. It shifts focus from visible distribution points to the systems that sustain them. So now the question turns outward. Where does the greater threat truly reside? In the visible movement of narcotics across communities, or in the unseen coordination that allows those movements to persist unnoticed? Share your perspective in the comments. And if you want deeper breakdowns of federal operations, organized crime structures, and the systems behind them, subscribe, like, and share State Tone, and join the discussion below.